moving to our brother Abdullah in New York, who helped kind of organize, especially the youth in New York, organize a Muslim contingency to make sure that folks are not just paying lip service to the movement, but also just making sure that they're present on the streets. So the title of this specific youth town hall, and it's not a town hall that's specifically just to youth. It's about really hearing from the youth on the front lines in multiple different ways about the take on what's happening, what's being done, and also how can we address combating racism both on the street, in the streets, as well as beyond that. So how can we as a Muslim community walk the walk when it comes to standing up for justice, and what is it going to take for us to be able to do that? So I want to invite Brother Abdullah to just talk about that experience, especially for a youth, for a youth who's not Black, right? And just understanding how can we, for our non-Black Muslim community, how can we also be individuals who are standing tall for justice? So Brother Abdullah.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Asmahan. So in New York, the situation, and I'm sure it's like this across the states, but specifically in New York, there was a group of youth that come together and they realized that the Muslim community needs to do more than talk. They need to put their words into action. And so they come up together, they get on a WhatsApp group chat, and they decide to do a Muslims against police brutality. Not because we should show only by saying, oh, Muslims are against police brutality, but we really need to show it because we do have a racism problem in our own Muslim communities. So not only are we telling other people from outside of the Muslim community that Muslims are against it, but we're also telling Muslims that we don't agree with this racism. We don't agree with how our Black brothers and sisters are being treated in our community. And earlier today, I was at a protest actually where we were crossing the Brooklyn Bridge and we went to the African Memorial in Manhattan. And many of the things that we've been noticing in the past couple of protests, the organizers have been looking and they've been realizing that the majority of these protests are filled with two people, with Black women and youth. And it shows so much that these are the people that are coming down to the streets, that the Black women are coming down in numbers from whichever kind of age, from the youngest all the way to the oldest we've seen. And the youth have been there and they're trying their best to make their voice. And they're fighting for many different things. And as you guys have seen, you guys might have seen qualified immunity and many different petitions that have been going around on either change.org or on their own private petition websites. And these petitions are really fighting for even more than racism, or they're fighting for some kind of systematic racism that puts Black men and women into this position that they are in today. For example, I have some numbers here. Out of 100 police officers that kill Black men or women, 96% of them go without a charge. One of them is convicted and 3 of them are charged. That means 99% of police officers that kill Black men or women are going out without being convicted. And this really shows very clear numbers to all of us that we should definitely learn from right away. Another thing that was really important that was evident today when we were listening to Jum'ah khutbah today, the Imam mentioned saying that many Muslim communities are in fear of speaking up or in fear of creating events or talking about it on Zoom sessions like this because they are scared because they have this own racism in their community that they feel the hypocrisy in going out and saying that there is something wrong when they have an example of Shukri Abdi, for example, in their own communities, where they have an example of another Black Muslim man or Muslim woman that he feels or she feels racism when they enter into the masjid. Where when they enter into the masjid, the Imam was telling us today that when a Black man or woman would enter into his own masjid, he would realize that the Imam would sometimes brush them off from saying salam. And this is something outrageous, not only in 2020, but as Muslims, we should understand that of the greatest leaders in our community, of the greatest leaders in Islamic history, were Muslim. Bilal, for example, was one of the greatest in our community, was one of the greatest in our history. And in that one story where Abu Dhar called him and he told him, "You son of a Black woman," the Prophet was outraged. And if we really believe in following the Prophet ﷺ and his teachings, then we should clearly take this as the first indication in being Muslim automatically should stop us from becoming or saying any kind of racist statements. Also, another thing that's extremely important on the ground is making sure that the Black Muslims are at the face of this. There are always a good amount of media at these protests. They're coming and asking for interviews and things like that. What we did as organizers is before the event, we'd make sure to write 5 Black Muslim women or Muslim men's names that when the news would come up to us and media come up to us and asking us, hey, we'd like to interview someone uh, organizing this protest, or we'd like to organize someone that could tell us more about this protest and their experience. We want to make sure that the Black story is out there. It's so important that the Black story is at the front line because their story has been taken away from them for so long. And it's crucial to give them their chance to give their story that has been neglected for so long, that has been put to the side for so long, that people have been ignoring, just to make sure that their voice is clear, because it really is enough is enough. People are fed up with having these same exact problems coming back up, having small protests every time a Black man or Black woman are killed due to either police brutality or due to some kind of racism or fake 911 call. But when organizers right now are on the ground are yelling out enough is enough, or I can't breathe, or say his name or say her name, and saying how do you spell racist and mentioning their police department, they really feel it. You feel the energy when you're in that crowd, that these people are putting their lives out there, especially the youth, that they might not be as susceptible to the coronavirus, but they have elders at home, they have parents, they have grandparents, that they know that what they are doing is a risk, but they feel like the risk that their Black brothers and sisters have been going through is much more than the risk of the coronavirus. They feel like they would rather go out and fight in these streets than they would rather go out and fight in these streets than do nothing and just sit at home and just share some posts, even though sharing these posts is extremely crucial. But at some point, the youth especially, I've noticed that they've shared some things once, twice, 3 times, and then at some point, one of the youth just texts me and he's like, hey, I've been sharing things for a while and I want to do something more. And you really see that whether they're going and organizing events on their own or whether they're doing impact from their own, just talking to their families, saying, hey, we can't be using the N-word anymore. We can't be saying Abid when we refer to Black men or Black women. We can't be saying that. So they start off in their families, and their families spread to their friends. And that's the easiest advice that I would give to anyone is start off where your family is. Tell them, hey, let's open a discussion and talk about this. Let's talk about Shukri Abdi. Let's talk about Breonna Taylor. Let's talk about George Floyd. Let's talk about it. And let's let this not just be an event that happened in our history where we just remembered it. Oh, a lot of people went out and protested during the coronavirus time and we got a second wave because of that. Let's remember it more to a time that, hey, during that time that we were in the coronavirus, when George Floyd died, that was the last of the police brutality. That was the last of those kinds of killings.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much. And again, we're going to have a lot of conversation in regards to this. I would like to invite my dear sister. I'm so happy that you were able to join us, Sister Nabintu, as we're talking about what youth are doing on the ground and responding, holding their families accountable, holding their communities accountable, and thinking about how just the way Brother Tariq kind of grounded us on the spiritual understanding of what it means for us to call for justice and call from a place where we're a place of humanity and a place of light of our deen. I want to bring up my dear sister Nabintu to share with us her thoughts. She was instrumental in helping put together this webinar as well with Sister Nand and the team, but just kind of going over those kind of less constructed conversation about genuine allyship versus performative allyship, and your take on what's happening currently right now in our in the larger American community.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thanks so much, Ismahan, Nandi, for organizing. Thank you all for having me. I jumped on here from another event. Glad I can make it. Yeah, I think this conversation is important. I'm glad that we're having it. I'm especially I think excited to really see the Black Muslim perspective being centered. and feel humbled to be able to be a part of this discussion. I honestly, I think so far, like so much of what has been said really resonates with me, and I don't want to, I think be redundant in any way if we, want to jump into like questions and answers or anything. I think what I will add, though, is I guess like two or three things. One, I think it's extremely important for the larger Muslim community to begin to interact with anti-Black racism as the systemic issue that it is. I think that for too long, we've remained very comfortable with trying to, view racism as just like this very interpersonal experience when that's just not the reality of it. It's institutionalized, it's systemic. If nothing else is proof of this, I think even, what we saw with COVID, where we saw, Black people and African Americans being disproportionately impacted and dying from this virus than any other people, right? But this is the reality when you have things that exist within our communities and that exists at a systemic level. And I think it's important for us to begin to think about that and have those sorts of conversations. Nandi, really touched upon, I think, a very important point about, thinking about these, quote unquote, like radical ideas, right? I think something that I would want to say to that is in connection to my prior point. I think that when we actually begin to take seriously and think seriously about the fact that racism is a systemic issue, then these solutions don't seem that radical at all, right? When you recognize how the police was created, and when you think about the ways and the alarming rates at which Black men, women, and Black children even are targeted and killed by law enforcement in this country, then it no longer seems that extreme to call on defunding the police. It actually seems extremely reasonable. So I think that, what I would encourage people, I'm hoping and imagining that there are majority non-Black Muslims on this call. I think that something that's really important when it comes to this topic in particular is to listen. Black people in general, Black Muslims, I guess specifically by virtue of our context being masked right now, don't really care that much about like what you think is realistic when we're trying to think up of solutions, because we know the position that we're in, and we know what it means, what it has meant for a long time to continue to be targeted by a system that was in fact built to target you. So I think that, and this is something that we've seen. This is something that we continue to see. I think a good example is in the conversation around reparations, right? People are like, well, how would that work, right? So when you're kind of like obsessed with like the logistics of things, I think that it really undermines what got people there, right? And it's not allowing us to really begin to actually think about how we can make these things realistic. I think the second thing I would say on this point is that for so many people, so many Black people in particular, this freedom to be able to imagine a different world in and of itself is an act of resistance, right? And I think that it's extremely important for us to be careful and cautious in how we interact with that, because that is what that is for people. And people, that's what keeps people invested, right? And I think secondly, that's a part of our sunnah as Muslims, right? Like we know that pre-Islamic Arab society came and was flipped on its head by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? There weren't these like little changes that were made here and there. No, the entire society had to be completely revamped in so many ways in order for Islam to even be able to come and exist and thrive in that society. And then I think lastly, just on an action point, I would definitely agree and echo what's already been said. It's so important for us to prioritize these conversations happening within our own spaces, right? So I think families, right, and friend groups first and foremost, and then communities. One thing that I know for sure, and that I think might be true for a lot of other Black people and Black Muslims, is we're not teaching y'all about racism anymore. We're done with that. So I think that it is befitting of everyone to learn about racism and to teach your own people about it. I am West African ethnically. I have to do the difficult work of like teaching my people about some anti-Black sentiments. I don't expect Black Americans to come and interact with my community and teach them. And so I think in the same way, none of us should expect Black people to be the ones who comes and who teaches us about the things that we need to do in order to, destabilize or dismantle these very problematic notions of anti-Black racism that exist within our communities. And I think it's important for that to, for us to take that to, an organizational level within MAS as well. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Navintu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you. And again, this is definitely not the beginning for a lot of us who've been having these conversations for a very, very long time. But I think we're standing at a moment of a crossroads of a sort where we have to really redefine what it means. Like, it's not just call for justice, it's really naming the harm of the impact of white supremacy, and then also naming the actual victims of white supremacy, which, while is all of us, is particularly our African American communities, right? And our Black communities, regardless of what that faith that they practice. So right now, I want to invite our dear brother Tariq to kind of just share with us also just his thoughts in regards to just about community accountability, and just from a Deen perspective, but also just responding to that time, which he mentioned earlier, but more so about accountability. What does accountability look like during this moment for us as a community, especially as we're rising to action? And I really appreciated what you said, Brother Tariq, in regards to really understanding our roots, especially as Muslims, and how we respond during these times. But what does accountability look like for us moving forward?
I think for my own self, in any situation, I think I have a natural care for people, but where I lack at, and where I fall short, I have this reminder in the back of my head that telling me you don't want to go to hell, and I don't want to use that threat here, but I think the reality is Allah is going to ask you about what you did and what you had the ability to do and what you did not do. And even for some people who said we were oppressed in the land, and this is for the people that genuinely didn't have the ability to do something, not those who genuinely didn't have the ability to do something. That's not going to be an excuse. You have to use every ounce of your ability that you can, because Allah is going to ask you about it. I definitely have people that I'm loyal to. I feel, the deen is nasiha, meaning, it's not just advice, but it's loyalty to the generality of the Muslims. And that's something that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us. So we definitely have that relationship there, but, there's some people who are better at holding us accountable. And there's some people, no matter what, you'll never be able to hold certain people accountable. But for myself, I don't want to fall short in applying justice, because I don't want to have to go to Allah with that. So I think that's a part of it. And I think that at the same time, I think that respectfully and firmly, we don't have to just demand justice, but we need to command justice, which means positioning ourselves in the type of way to where we are calling the shots, and not just asking for shots to be made in our favor. We need to be shooting the buckets. We don't need to just be fans and coaches or assistant coaches. We need to be really movers of chess pieces. We need to be more than pawns. So it's always hard to hold somebody else accountable, but it's easy to hold yourself accountable. Easier to hold yourself accountable, and it's harder to demand justice than it is to command justice.
That's really, really powerful. I want us to sit with that for a second. SubhanAllah, that's a really powerful way of putting that. The next question that we have, and folks, feel free to utilize the Q&A box for our questions, inshallah, is my dear sister Nandi. So as you mentioned, when we talk about these kind of like radical ideas, they're not so radical because, subhanAllah, like you're looking at the very lives that are being taken by systems of oppression. So legality has not always matched with morality. There have been laws. I mean, if you think about it, even for our liberation as Black folks in America, it came as an amendment in the Constitution that still stands till this day. And so how do we kind of like navigate through this, especially for the larger non-Black Muslim community, is understanding that the law does not always mean that that's what's just. I mean, the Muslim ban is in effect, right, as an executive order, but we know that, on every level, it's wrong, it's hurting, it's tearing families apart. So as we are addressing these questions, and as the nation is wrestling with this question, and we as a community are wrestling with this question, how can we keep kind of like foremost in our mind? What advice would you give about having the courage to act, even in those moments where you know that legality does not always match with morality?
So that's a very good question. I think what you said, Ismahan, kind of like answers the question in itself. Like, when we think about a lot of the laws that have been put into place and why they've been put into place, it's I'm going to reword that. Okay. So not necessarily when you look at the laws, but if the basis of a law is in fact immoral and is founded in immorality, in oppression, in injustice, then I feel like it's more so our duty to fight against that. And so when we see these laws or these policies or that have been put into place specifically to ensure that one group of people is being oppressed or is being put into a quote unquote permanent second class status, then there shouldn't, in my opinion, there shouldn't be a question of how do we move past this, even though legally, like, this is what it says, but the reality on the ground is something totally different. There's the entire history of the United States, and 98% of the laws that were passed in this country were grounded in immorality to begin with. And so I think the advice that I would give is injustice is injustice, whether our government says it's legal or not. Someone in the comments is saying slavery was legal, right? In the state of Florida, putting 12-year-old kids in adult prisons for stealing a bike is legal, right? In the state of Florida, having someone held in prison or in many different states, someone being held in prison for an expired license is legal. In the entire United States, half of the prison, there's a good portion of the prison population are people who are in prison because of crimes of poverty. So just from that, you can say it's quote unquote illegal just to be poor and to try and survive in the United States, right? And so we can't necessarily rely on the legality of things as proof or as our push to move forward against something that we can clearly see is unjust. And my advice would be to I don't know, I guess to open your eyes and to just to see what's happening on the ground. Like I hear this conversation all the time, and this is probably something that's a little bit controversial. Like when the people talk about like people being put into prison for like marijuana use or for like selling marijuana, right? And there are millions of Black men in prison for selling marijuana, and now it's quote unquote legal, and there are a lot of white people making millions of dollars off of that, right? If we go back to the '94 crime bill that Joe Biden wrote and passed, caused the war on drugs, where a lot of people my age and our parents and our families were torn apart and put into prison over a slight definition change between crack and cocaine. It's the same drug, but white people use one, Black people use the other, and Black people are put in prison, but white people aren't, right? And and so people will say, well, they shouldn't have been using drugs to begin with, right? But then we talk about how like the United States government put the drugs in the Black communities so that in order to fund a war in somewhere else. And so like the issue of legality being our premise for whether or not we can fight for or against injustice seems very just not relevant for me, because especially for my people, and I think as we've seen now with Trump, it's just kind of like a throwback to like everyone gets like a taste of what we've been going through for forever and a day. Legality means nothing when people are dying.
That's a really powerful way of saying it. Our dear sister Malika used another word in the chat, which I definitely agree with. If you even look at the 13th Amendment, folks may not be aware of this if we're not in the field, is slavery in certain ways is still legal till this day. If you look at folks who are in the front lines, I live in California, so there's wildfires almost all the time. Just last night, there was 2 wildfires in our area. And if you look at folks who are out there handling these wildfires, you'll see is from the prison populations, right? Which are majority communities of color. They're not paid, or even if they are, it's cents compared to what they deserve to be paid. So in some form, slavery still is legal through the prison system and through just understanding that whole concept. And Jazakallah khair, Brother Bilal. Yes, the Brother Khalif Broder, I believe, in New York City, who was accused of stealing a backpack, ended up doing time, and subhanallah, that I would invite folks to look into his story. It's really, really powerful, and it just shows you exactly what's wrong with America. So my next question is to Brother Abdullah. Alhamdulillah, and folks, feel free, inshallah, to utilize the chat to ask any questions, or feel free to ask in the Q&A session, the Q&A box below. So Brother Abdullah, this moment that we're also living in, and Jazakumullah khairan for sharing that, the responsibility, especially for folks who are not Black, to really handle and have these tough conversations within their family and help kind of like change the conversations, right? So things are shifting right now in the nation as is. And I was so happy to see you and so many of the other youth really being on the front lines and saying, we're not going to take this. What advice would you leave to the youth who are still not seeing this issue as their issue, simply because of the color of their skin or because of the privilege in which they live in, right? Because those of us from that background really dealing with a racist systemic system that's in place, the racist structures that are in place systemically, know the pains that are involved, know what it's going to take to realize that change. And sometimes it's not the glamorous work, it's the work behind the scenes, is pushing, a resolution or measures or policy change from city level all the way to a congressional level, all the way to, the highest level of office. So what advice would you give to the youth and folks who are still not seeing this as their fight to fight for the liberation of our Black community?
Yeah. So I truly believe that if you decide not to fight or decide not to educate yourself on what's going on right now and what has been going on for those years, there will be a day where it will come to your door, where you would wish that you have fought for the people that right now are facing racism or whatever it is. And the next time when a Muslim ban happens or ICE is at your door for your parents or for your grandparents, you would have wished that you fought for those people in those protests, or you fought for the Black Muslims and the Black communities. So everything will come around towards you. Everything will come one day to your doorstep, and you would have wished you have thought that you had fought for this fight. And another advice that I would give is, it's really not that hard to go and educate yourself on some of these issues, just a basic education, because a lot of people, if you would see on Instagram or Twitter or wherever it is, you'd see a lot of people don't have the basic education on what's happening in their Black communities, or what's happening at their masjid, or what's happening anywhere near what's happening to Black Muslims across the country in the history or right now. And if you were to bring up any kinds of statistics towards them, if you bring up like the wage gap from Black women compared to a white man, they would tell you, oh, that's all fake. That's not real. And they really don't believe it because they really haven't looked into it. They really haven't spoken to someone firsthand that has went through that. And that's why it's really important to share Black stories, to share them and make sure that their voice is heard. And there are so many Black stories. And right now we're in the age of the internet, where it's not that you have to send an email or go see someone in person. You can search up online Black stories of whoever you want, of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of anyone else, of those names of the people that haven't gotten famous off their names, of the people that are exactly like George Floyd, that have been either killed by the police or have faced racism or police brutality, that their names didn't get to the news. And their families are still in pain. Their families still remember, and their stories still need to be remembered. So the number one advice I would give is to educate yourself and educate others. And for the youth that are educated, it is your 100% obligation to go to the youth that are not obligated and let them know exactly what's happening. Explain to them, break it down to them, and make it easy for them to understand. Some youth might not want to understand it because they might just think it's too complicated, or they might even get overwhelmed by the information that is out there. We all can agree that there are so many petitions out there online. There are so many different movements going on right now on the internet, so many different hashtags going on. So some youth could get overwhelmed, and giving them the benefit of the doubt in that one kind of special situation, it still does not change the fact that they should still reach out and educate themselves. And after educating themselves, you should put that education into action and either educate others or sign on to petitions. Create change from your own communities and move it on. And after you create that change, you can move on and share your story on how you created that change. Just so then other youth can get motivated by your actions. Some youth might, in the beginning, might not want to read a story about a Black man or a Black woman that was affected by racism. But later on, when they see another youth, maybe even a non-Black youth, that decided to go out of their way to go and read about Black lives, to go and read about those Black stories, they might be motivated. That aside from their privilege, aside from everything that they are allowed to have right now, that Black Muslim men and women do not have nowadays, they will decide to go and do that on their own and research those stories. And I think that's the number one advice I would give.
Jazakumullahu khairan. And I think a critical thing to uplift there, which a lot of the panelists has mentioned, is when it comes to the education piece, it's on you. It's not on our Black communities to kind of like do that education. There are multiple different resources and toolkits available. And for us here at Mass, in multiple different levels, inshallah, we're going to be very intentional about how we go about in terms of that training, right? Alhamdulillah, even before this, really thinking about what is our duty as Muslims, especially during this time, to one, address anti-Blackness within our specific communities, and from organizational perspective all the way down on an individual. We all have a role to play to really, I guess, dismantle, and I know that's a word that folks are not too comfortable with, but dismantle the anti-Blackness and racism that kind of exists both in the streets and beyond, subhanAllah. So last question that I wanted to ask, inshallah, Sister Nabintu, and this one I just have to, alhamdulillah, may Allah bless you all, is in this current moment that we're living in, and we have the use of social media and internet and so many different other ways to kind of uplift the Black liberation movement and the Black liberation struggle. And during this moment, what advice would you give to folks to kind of move beyond that hashtag solidarity to the real work that needs to happen? Because it's not about, and this is a critical point, especially for those of us who've been in this for a very long time, how can we go beyond what's trending at that moment and realize the very lives that have been impacted, continue to be impacted, and will be impacted by the system until we create that change that we need. So what advice would you give to hashtag activists, and how do you move folks from that angle, inshallah?
Yeah, thank you, Ismahan. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that the education component is ongoing, right? I don't think there is ever going to be a time where it's okay. I think I've learned enough. I'm good. I think it's extremely important to realize that there's only like more levels to how much more we can expose ourselves to just more information. I mean, I think like whether you decide to start from a history perspective or a political perspective, I think ultimately all of them intertwine in some way. And so it will be, I think, crucial to continue to explore all of those levels. I think a second thing still within the education realm is to really also benefit from people who are within our community. So organizations that immediately come to mind are like Muslim Wellness Foundation, Muslim Arc, to really utilize these organizations for the trainings that they have put together without necessarily having to feel this need to always like create something new or create something anytime something happens. I don't think that makes much sense because we have these resources that are already readily available to us. I think it's important to use them. And then I mean, I guess the second thing, and I think something that has been mentioned all throughout this conversation, is for people to start having these conversations in their homes. And I think that it's only then that we will realize how much work dismantling anti-Black racism is, right? Like I've heard stories of people getting into fights with family members, not speaking with people for like, you know, extended periods of time. I don't know, but I guess like I guess I share that to say that it's very difficult work, right? Like when you realize how deeply ingrained so many of these things are, it's not going to be as easy as, you know, live streaming a 13 documentary. I don't know, like it's going to include so many conversations. It's going to be a matter of, you know, checking family members every single time something anti-Black comes out of their mouth, because I think that that's really how we get to the root of it. And then I think thirdly is it's really important for non-Black Muslims especially to really take seriously how exhausted Black Muslims are with, you know, having to do this work even at an organizational level. I think whether it's asking organizations to center Black perspectives, experiences, and voices, or asking them to diversify their leadership with Black board members, right? But this ranges from Masajid to some of our oldest organizations. I think it's really important that people realize that one of the most crucial parts of allyship is that you're making that call, that you're doing that work, right? That you are calling chapter presidents and boards of organizations and letting them know that their boards are not representative enough, that they're not diverse enough, and not necessarily waiting on Black Muslims to have to come and to talk about those things. One of the things that I've been talking about consistently throughout, you know, events of this sort, and a good example of what I think I'm talking about here as well, is the fact that I live in Michigan. We still have masajid that regularly interact and work with law enforcement. That's not okay, right? But me like that, but it's extremely exhausting for me as a Black Muslim to continue to take that on and to make that my call, and, you know, without any support. I think that's a great starting point. I think you should look up your local masajid and find out who still has, I don't know what y'all are out here doing. I don't know if people have like contracts with the police or something. I don't know. But I think it's important to find out what the relationship with your local masjid looks like with the police and to deal with that, right? There's no reason that people should have to. My brother is 5'11", he's 12 years old. I'm not going to any masjid that has a relationship with the cops, right? I don't trust that space. So I think it's extremely important for us to take these kinds of calls to action serious, and for us to realize that we can actually start making so much of this change and this impact directly at home, right? That it doesn't have to exist and look as big picture as I think we like to think it does.
Jazakumullah khairan. Alhamdulillah, that's a really important point. Just really want to invite folks, please go to masspace.org. We're going to be just a couple of quick action calls to action, inshallah, and then I would like our dear brother Tariq to close us off, inshallah. Go to masspace.org. We are going to continue this series, as well as more specific actions that you can take, whether it's on an individual level, to community level, to organizational level, inshallah. And I think it's critical for us at this point too, when it comes to just our duty and our sense of Islam, right? Alhamdulillah, Islam is a faith that is meant to be acted upon. It's not a faith that is meant just for us to call to justice and talk about liberation. Islam is a liberating ideology, alhamdulillah. So with that sense, we all have a duty to ourselves and to our community at large to, one, listen to the very voices that have been on the front lines of this and whose pain has really brought us the change that we have currently, and will continue to push for the changes and that we command, not demand. Alhamdulillah. But at the same time, also recognizing that it's going to take all of us to be able to do this, and holding elected officials accountable, holding folks accountable as we move forward, and that we're not combating racism just in the streets as we protest, but also we're pushing from a systemic point of view. And a lot has been mentioned, from individual to family to workplaces. Racism has got to be costly, subhanAllah. So with that, I want to invite Brother Tariq Ali, inshallah, to share with us a few closing statements.
Sorry, Ismahan, is it okay really quick if I just plug in some resources that just came to mind, at least from our chapter? Or
yes.
We want to, yeah, so I just also wanted to plug that. So our chapter here in Michigan have created a team, and we're sort of working around some of these issues. And so one of the things that we are doing that I think is extremely important is a Pitfalls podcast that sort of speaks to, the ways in which we can sort of fall into, I think, in trying to do good work, how we can actually, do it the wrong way. And so being able to catch those things, doing different events that are centering the Black narrative with Imam Dawood Walid. So I just wanted to encourage people to like the Mass Detroit page, and be on the lookout for those sorts of projects.
Jazakallah khairan, alhamdulillah. Brother Tariq.
Assalamu alaikum, bismillah. In closing out, there's one thought that came to mind, is that we have different perspectives here, and in any struggle, any political struggle, any socio-political struggle, and when it comes to socio-economic advancement, any practice that occurs in this world, there's going to be differences of perspectives, and there's also going to be changes that come to people's minds as they pursue their particular practice. And right now we're referring to struggle. And one thing that I do know is that regardless of your struggle, regardless of your position, in order to struggle, specifically for Muslims, we have to center Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I don't mean that particularly in this sense of we have to always have this feeling of spiritual jubilation, or we have to always be at this place of pondering necessarily on the majestic aspects of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's perfect, that's good. But one thing that we do need to is that we need to, as many of the scholars have taught us, is to adorn ourselves, embody the virtues in the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This struggle that we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about Western colonialism, Western imperialism that really stretches back all the way to Greece, and that became Greco-Roman, and about what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, that we would have to fight with Ahlul Rum until the Yawm al-Qiyamah. So we need to look into Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name as Al-Baqi, the everlasting, because this is an everlasting struggle in terms of the dunya. We need to look at terms of strength. We need to apply the strength that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, and we need to seek it, and we need to try to embody that, so that we can continue to struggle. Steadfastness, focus, everlastingness, and in terms of dealing with one another, love, mercy, compassion, and justice. I think that for us in particular, to this particular conversation about in terms of being activists, in terms of being people who struggle, is looking at the names of Allah and the meanings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that particularly are necessary, so that we do not get tired, so that we do not burn out, so that we do not give up, because this evil that we are talking about is old. It precedes a well-documented history, and so I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to see by His name, Nur Samawati wal Ard. He blesses us to see with His light the truth of these matters, and that we are blessed with the internal and the external capabilities to deal with all these matters, to deal with these struggles, and that we become people who are speakers, articulators of truth, possessors of wisdom, establishers of justice and compassion. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakumullah khairan wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. And folks, do check out masspace.org. We are going to be approaching this from a systemic viewpoint, subhanAllah, especially when it comes to advocacy efforts that we can do and the pressure that we can apply on elected officials to meet the demands and commands of the people, subhanAllah. I think, and I will close with this. Frederick Douglass mentioned that power concedes nothing without a demand. And right now, what you're seeing out on the streets is the demands for justice, the commands. I'm trying to use the terminology that you gave us, Brother Tariq, alhamdulillah. But how can we as Muslims also be at the front lines of this as our faith teaches us to act, inshallah. So please sign up, mathspace.org. Jazakallah khair, Sister Hannah, for providing the link to Math Detroit's Facebook. But continue to tune in, inshallah. Download the toolkit on masspace.org and see what you can do on a personal level, inshallah, and the actions that you can take, as well as upcoming toolkits. So jazakumullah khairan. I appreciate each and every single one of our panelists. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all, accept from you. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. Accountability from all different levels, change on all different levels, systemic change that we're trying to create in this nation right now, currently as it stands, is going to require further conversations, further dialogue, further opportunities for us to act, to advocate, and do the best that we can on an individual level, all the way up to a communal level, inshallah. And through all of this, of course, we can't do it without the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our theme in Ramadan was to rise to worship and rise to action. So use the energy and the spiritual strength that you've cultivated during Ramadan to really show up in these times, inshallah, and continue to make dua as you act, because subhanallah, this is a type of work. This is a type of work, especially as Muslims, that one, we are absolutely obligated to be engaged in. But the second point is the strength and the will and the results are going to come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The action, the effort is going to come from us, inshallah. So we will have more information available. Please check out mathspace.org and stay tuned, inshallah, for our next webinar, Fridays at 6 p.m. 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of us. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.